I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight, especially as this is kind of the Easter week and going towards a long weekend. It's lovely that you've come. I want to also thank Shauna and Jason for inviting me, and Ken for his work with the technology. And I want to say, Shauna, it's been a lot of fun working with you. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. So my apologies in presenting on Zoom. As Shauna said, I'm immunocompromised because I've got stage 4 cancer. Also, I got COVID. And so my husband and I were recouping from COVID. And when Shauna said, yep, they could make this work if I could come via Zoom, I seized upon it because I wanted to fulfill my commitment. So the lovely thing is I thought I would be speaking to myself, in essence, seeing a big Annette on the screen, but I'm actually seeing you folks, which is just lovely. I hope if you cannot hear me, please put up your hand. Let me know if you can't, but I've got my speaker on high, and I know that Shauna and Ken have worked on stuff. So I came across this concept of chronic sorrow about 10 years ago in the academic literature, and there is some stuff written about it, but not as much as should be. When I saw it, I thought, this is really an interesting and important and relevant concept. Little would I know that it wouldn't be too far down the road when it would apply to me, when it would be relevant in my own life. So in 2019, I was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer. Not initially, but about 8 months into living with it, I started to see the losses that were piling up. And it was really difficult. The concept became very real to me because I couldn't really talk to people and say, excuse me, I'm really quite sad because I've lost this and this and this, because the thought was, well, you should just be happy you're alive. And so this is a really good concept. So we're looking at chronic sorrow, navigating its presence over the long haul. So what is it? Well, it's a set of pervasive, profound, continuing, and recurrent responses resulting from a significant loss or absence of crucial aspects of oneself, so self-loss, or another living person, so other loss, to whom there is a deep attachment. The way in which the loss is perceived determines the existence of chronic sorrow. And the essence of chronic sorrow is that it's a painful discrepancy between what is perceived as reality and what continues to be dreamed of. That's huge. What I believe my life to be and what I thought it should have been. And there's a difference. The loss is ongoing since the source of the loss continues to be present. So the loss is a living loss. So very often we talk about grief, and we talk about grief within the context of losing someone we love through death, which obviously is a very difficult thing to deal with. However, there's the losses that are living losses that result in chronic sorrow. And they're very difficult to deal with because we've lost another person or we've lost parts of ourselves, but we're still here. So other people don't recognize it. So what may result in chronic sorrow? Well, changes in a loved one due to being born with an intellectual or developmental disability. So initially, when this concept came out in the literature, it was 1962 by a gentleman named Olshansky. And he talked about the losses that people received when they had a child, say, born with Down syndrome. And as that child continued to grow, and he or she could not meet the developmental milestones that children in the general public could meet. And so the parents experienced significant loss. So maybe the child didn't go to kindergarten. Maybe the child had to go to a special school for grade 1. The child could not do other things that other kids could do. And so very often their hearts were gripped with sorrow, and it was a real sorrow. There can be changes in a loved one due to a stroke. So we talk about not so much a child, but we talk about a sibling, an adult sibling, or a spouse due to a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, or dementia, as an example. So this person is no longer the person we once knew and the person we loved. And then trying to adjust to those changes and those losses of, this is my sibling, this is my spouse, but this isn't really my spouse. And then it can be self-loss. So changes in yourself because of illness, cancer, strokes. Years ago, I worked at the old Calgary General Hospital. And if anyone has been a native Calgarian, you'll remember that it got imploded. Anyways, I remember the odd time being pulled to work on a unit with largely 20-something-year-old guys that had either, they had an accident and they were either paraplegic, so they had use of their arms but not their legs, or they were quadriplegic. And you know, the number of people that were on marijuana before it was legalized. And why? Because they couldn't deal with the fact that now they couldn't do what they once did. And their body didn't represent who they truly were or who they saw that they were. And that's a big thing when our bodies don't do what we tell them to do, and they don't express who we are anymore. Perhaps we have what's called aphasia. We've had a stroke and we cannot speak. And maybe we've been a public speaker. Maybe we've been a teacher, and we can no longer do what we once did. So what might we experience when we have chronic sorrow due to a living loss? Well, profound grief. And it's not just a little bit of grief. It can be a huge amount of grief that is evoked in us when we or someone we love cannot complete or maintain developmental milestones. So in the case of a child, it can be that he or she is not able to complete developmental milestones. If it is a teenager that got injured and is now a paraplegic, maybe he or she will get married, but maybe they won't. Maybe they'll have children, but maybe they won't. And so the hopes and dreams we had for that person don't come true. So for instance, a child cannot walk due to severe cerebral palsy. Well, that evokes a strong response of grief in parents. Remember, though, people see that the child is alive. And so then if they wonder why you feel so much grief, because the child is there, but the child isn't meeting the developmental milestones that were expected. A spouse can no longer feed himself or herself due to dementia. And as the dementia progresses onwards, there is continuing losses because Alzheimer's or other dementias are progressive, and there can be losses that keep on going on. And caregivers, often spouses or adult children, will say they grieve with every time the person takes a step downward. where the person cannot do this or cannot do that, or they don't remember us. So my identical twin sister and I had, with our father, our mom had dementia related to strokes, a vascular dementia, and she could always remember us. And so she forgot things, but she always remembered us. But our father probably had an Alzheimer's dementia. And in the end, he didn't know who we were. And even though we'd say, Dad, you know, I'm Annette, I'm your daughter, he didn't know what Dad meant, and he didn't know what daughter meant. And when we went through some of his papers to clear out the house, because he hadn't passed yet, but he had moved to assisted living, we found slips of paper that said, my children's names are Eric, Roland, Victor, Annette, Marlette. And that was such a surprise to us, because at that point in time, he seemed to be functioning a little better than we thought he was. And an individual can no longer work because of the constraints of an illness. And so this is self. So when a person is diagnosed with ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease, where they lose the functioning of the muscles, and so they end up in a wheelchair and that sort of thing, or MS, for some people, losing their work is a huge issue. So we might also experience confusion about why we experience grief. After all, a child is still alive, despite the fact that he or she can't walk. We may think, well, why do I feel so bad? At least my child was born. A spouse is still here, even though she or he cannot dress or eat by themselves. And then an individual is still alive, although not working. And sometimes for people, when there's an illness related that happens to themselves, other people think, well, they should be happy because at least they're alive. But the person may think, I'm really not that happy because I can't do what I once did. There's also a pervasive sense of loneliness. People feel really alone. Others do not understand how difficult it is to grieve each time a child cannot enter activities with other children. Or if it's an adult, people will say, I don't get it. Jim looks pretty much the same as I've always known him, for cases of dementia. And sometimes people with dementia, particularly in the early stages, they can cover some. They can come up with their social skills. So if you ask them and say, how are you doing? I'm doing great, thank you. How are you? Or if you say it's nice weather, isn't it? Oh, it's lovely. But moments later, the person can turn around and say, what season is it? Which I had one time. I've done a lot of work with older adults with dementia and with mental illnesses. And that's exactly what a gentleman said to me. I was with the Alzheimer's Society. We were out on a bus. We were going to walk in Glenmore Park. And I turned to him and I said, it's lovely weather, isn't it? Because it was February and there was no snow. And he said, it is, it's lovely. But moments later, he said to me, what season is it? So there is an ability to cover for a little bit. And the individual may feel a profound sense of isolation, no longer being part of a work site. Because work sites are where relationships and conversations just seem to happen organically. When we're at work, we bump into each other and we chat with each other. But that can be lost if our spouse is needing full-time care or if we're needing it. Anger and guilt can really be a part of chronic sorrow. There can be the why me. And I didn't realize that Marlette is going to talk about the whys in June, which I think will be a really good topic because my twin sister is a palliative care chaplain and she's heard all of the why me's. Did I do something to deserve this? And that can come when we have a sense of, I have failed this or that in my life. I have made mistakes. And is this divine punishment or the fates, retribution of the fates or the universe? It's amazing the number of people who do think, did I do something to deserve this? Just a couple of points. Remember that anger is normal. The one thing, though, we need to be careful about is with anger, we need to realize it's normal. We need to let ourselves feel it and not feel badly about it. But we need to make sure that we don't take our anger out on ourselves or anger out on others. You know, there's the old adage about, and this is about when parents lose a child. What does the mom do? She talks and talks and talks. What does the dad do? He's out ripping apart the deck, board by board by board, and then laying down the planks again and pounding the nails because that's how he gets that physical anger out. Now, that is very gender typical to say that. I mean, there may be some women who build decks, but that's just sort of the stereotype. Guilt is universal in grief. This is really important to learn. And in being perfectly honest, I learned that from Marlette. People, everybody across the world feels guilt when there's a death or feels guilt when there's chronic sorrow. And very often the guilt is not rational. Very often it's just a case of we feel helpless. We feel like we cannot do enough to help the other who is hurting or to help ourselves. But guilt and grief can be very difficult to deal with, and anger as well. And so I talk about later on, if we need some help with it, we should seek help in that area if we need it. So what else might we experience with chronic sorrow? We can experience a loss of structure that we would create. So all of us have structure in our lives, and it's deeply meaningful whether we know it or not. So we form often, we get up at a certain time, we have certain routines, we do things. If we go to work in the morning or afternoon or however long, then to sit down with the news and a couple of favorite programs in the evening feels great. Why? Because we're rewarding ourselves because we have the structure in the day. When we lose that structure, and sometimes older adults do, particularly with dementia, when we lose that structure, it's very difficult, and there's sorrow in that. So if it's a child who has a serious illness or condition that entails structure, where you as a caregiver have to go and help this person on a regular basis all through the day, you may have structure, but it's not the structure that you have created around yourself. It's the structure that is demanded by the needs of the child through no fault of his or her own. However, then you've got to cater your days to that person, and then you're not getting out and about with people like you normally would, or caregiving for a spouse rather than working. Again, you can lose that structure that comes through work or through volunteer work or that sort of a thing. What else might we experience? This is a big one, and I certainly feel this one is loss of an expected future. You or the close other can no longer expect perhaps that you'll travel in retirement due to the life-changing illness of your partner or yourself. Or you need to travel now, toot sweet, right away, because you know in a while that person isn't going to be able to do so. And if you happen to be a caregiver of someone with dementia, one of the challenges is that the short-term memory goes, the long-term memory is more intact. And so if you take a person, let's say to Australia, the person may be completely befuddled and quite upset and quite not know what to do, because that's not in that person's long-term memory. And so very often we talk about that with people with dementia. We talk with the caregivers and we say, as much as possible, don't make too many changes because the person's short-term memory isn't able to accommodate that. Or you need to retire early. And that's my situation. And that's hard for me. What else might we experience? Oh, it's the existential stuff. Loss in belief about life or God is fair. And I should say that that existential loss for some people is mammoth. For some people, that existential loss of who I felt I could depend on, God, and that if I did right, God would do right by me and give me what I want. When that is destroyed by an illness, it's devastating. And some people say that's almost worse than the illness or than the paralysis or whatever else. It's the when you have a belief now that life isn't fair and that all heck can break loose, that can be devastating for people. That is really tough to deal with. So very painful, causes existential issues. And what I mean by existential, broadly speaking, in kind of conversation, we say, well, existential pertains to meaning and purpose in life. And if you now have existential issues because you're in a wheelchair, or you've had a major stroke and you can't do what you once did, the sense of who am I, and I'm no use to this world anymore. It would be better if I was gone. Those can be huge issues for people. And the thing that people think I've done everything right, and yet this situation or this illness has destroyed our lives. You'd be surprised at how many people live with the notion of, if I do right, then I will be rewarded with it. And it doesn't have to be a belief in God or in a deity. It can be a belief in just the universe and the fates, and everything should fall in place. And that doesn't necessarily happen. So it can lead to some major soul searching, where people say, what do I really believe? And that can be extremely painful. What else do we lose? Well, we have a loss of identity with chronic sorrow, a sense of self-worth, particularly if we built our self-worth in a few different areas and we've been really good at it. And if we lose those areas, the sorrow can be very strong, and the loss of self-worth, of self-respect and dignity and self-confidence can be a real issue, a real difficult thing. Also with chronic sorrow, please know that grieving is hugely exhausting. If you are grieving losses in someone you love or losses in yourself, please be good to yourself. Where possible, please get extra rest, because grieving is incredibly exhausting. And managing the sorrow internally is difficult when others have had enough of your story. But somehow you still need to talk. And that's been a problem for me. Every now and then, if I say something about my illness, some people are caught tongue-tied, and they mean well. I absolutely know they mean well and that they like me. But sometimes they just cannot say anything. They don't know what to do with it. But that's hard, because then you have to tell yourself, I need to stuff it. I need to stuff it down when I'm with other people and say nothing. In order to protect them, I need to be quiet about the sorrow that I'm feeling. So my story, and I don't think I've ever told my story in public. And when Marlette and I have presented in the past, before COVID, we would present on grief and different things, and I would never say anything. So this is very unusual for me. I was diagnosed in 2004 with early stage breast cancer. So I was in my early 40s. Did everything right. Changed my diet, continued with a lifelong obsession with exercise, had regular checks, numerous checks, sometimes more than even required if the doctor was concerned. In 2018, I knew there was something terribly wrong. And in 2019, I was diagnosed with stage 4 metastatic breast cancer. That resulted in a couple of surgeries because I actually had a hip replacement. Besides the usual surgery for breast cancer, I had a hip replacement because I had a metastasis to the neck of my right femur. So a total hip replacement. I've had numerous courses of radiation and meds, and more meds. And then the side effects of the meds, and the side effects are terrible. So I'm not the same anymore. I have prided myself on being, I think, an intelligent academic, but a very compassionate academic, and one who was really clinically oriented. I knew my stuff. But now I have trouble word finding, and it's the medications I'm on. And one time I asked an oncologist, I said, do I have chemo brain? I'm not on regular chemotherapy, but it's like chemo, and it's called targeted therapy. And he said, no, it's not that, Annette. It's the letrozole. It's the stuff that is meant to absolutely wipe away all estrogen from my body, because my tumor is estrogen feeding. So now I can't come up with words. And when I'm working with strong academics, I've really got to be sharp, and I'm not sharp anymore. Physically, I'm different. I can't run, and I ran for 40 years. Now, some may say, and they're probably right, it's probably good I don't run anymore, because that's done a number to ankles and feet and knees. But that was a source of joy, and it was a source of identity. Can't do that anymore. I said that about cognitively different, that I'm slower than I was before. Psychologically, I'm different. So part of it is good. Things that bothered me in the past, now I can just say, oh, well, in the broader scheme of things, this isn't so bad. If I'm stuck in traffic, oh, well, it's nothing that is terribly life-shattering. The downside, though, is that things that didn't used to bother me now do. And it bothers me when, and this is awful, but it bothers me when I see my colleagues forging ahead with their careers. Even though I'm 60, I thought I would go at least 65, if not late 60s. They're forging ahead with their careers. They're winning awards. They're getting on big research projects, but I'm never asked because, you know, I'm the one that is stage 4 cancer, and I'm important, but I'm not important. I'm not really part of the game anymore. Emotional lows can be lower, and this is something that I found really difficult. It used to be that if I was low due to a lifelong problem with depression, but I could tell when I was going down. And then I knew to call my doctor's office and have an appointment and maybe tweak the meds a little bit. So I was really good with that. But now I can be like this, even keeled, and suddenly in the pit. It's an awful thing. And I can't even foresee it coming. So the lows are really low. And I regularly see a psychologist, never done that. But I somehow have to talk about existential issues, about losses, about what to do when I find myself in the pit. Interesting though, highs are higher. And that's odd to say why highs are higher. But part of it is now with when I'm, you know, doing something with my husband and we're just having a great time, life just feels sweeter because there's been so many losses. Or I'm out with my brother Eric, who happens to be sitting in the audience. Sorry, Eric. I'm out with Eric and my brother, and we're walking and in Boness Park. And Eric is a historian, and we're talking about history and politics and culture. And I love it. And I drive home and think, well, that was just about the best thing that's happened in weeks, even though we do it every week, and it's so good. Or I'm out with my sister, or my sister and brother-in-law and Dave and I were hiking in Utah, in Bryce and Zion. Those are mountaintop experiences when they wouldn't normally be, because now there's enough negatives and there's enough losses that when there's things that are really enjoyable, oh, they are sweet. Existentially, I'm different. So I spoke about the issues, about what I can't do. And so my body no longer represents who I am. How I view myself as an athlete and as an academic. And so those are problematic. But in contrast, my faith has deepened substantially. When I was diagnosed, the first couple of months, I was absolutely terrified because there wasn't much to say. Yes, I thought there would be stage 1, but not that it would be stage 4. And we didn't know, would I end up with metastases all through my body? And I was told, you have a 1 in 2 chance of making it 5 years. The stats said I had about a 30% chance of making it 5 years. I was terrified, but something happened in March of that year. I felt the love of God in a way that I've never, ever felt the love of God. And it was huge. And it was mammoth. And that love carried me all the way through August. when I got a phone call from the oncologist to say, Annette, your scan is clear. And I said, excuse me? And he said, there's no metastases. And he said, Annette, I think we're going to be able to keep you going for some time. Now, since that time, I've had several more metastases in my spine, in my pelvis, and in my sternum. But they're small, and I have had high-powered radiation for it, so I'm being managed. But I have to say, during that 8-month phase, when I really didn't know if I was going to live or die, even though I had been a Christian for many, many, many years, but the love of God was huge. And so I'm different. Even though I may not experience it to the level I did back then, I'm very different because of it, and that's been a positive. So what can we do about chronic sorrow in ourselves? Number one, please know that it's normal. It's a normal response to grief. So sometimes in mental health and in medicine and healthcare, we pathologize grief. And certainly we'll talk, other people may talk about complicated grief or prolonged grief. But in the case of chronic sorrow, it is perfectly normal. Of course, you would be experiencing that. Please know that chronic sorrow may be present all of your life. And so then your task is learning to live alongside the chronic sorrow. You don't put it away. You don't stuff it in a closet or try to totally suppress it. You learn to walk alongside that grief and sorrow and say, this is part of my life, and at times I've got to give attention to it, but it's not all of me. And I can still be known for who I am if you're in a caregiving role, or for who I am if you yourself are the patient or have experienced some traumatic event. Please know that there's in time an ability to walk alongside with that chronic sorrow. A huge thing in the literature now is making meaning out of your loss, whether it be grief from a loved one or whether it be chronic sorrow. We used to say, and this was very Freudian, you can tell I have a mental health nursing background, used to be very Freudian, the notion of that after a year, your grief should be gone. And if it's not gone, you've got a problem. There still is a bit of that hanging around. But certainly now we say, and we used to say, people need to move on from the deceased person. But now we say, no, we relocate the deceased person. They're in my heart. They're in the cemetery. They're in heaven. And we make meaning out of our loss. When people can make meaning out of their loss, they can do so much better than if they're left with a situation where they say, all of this is meaningless. So making meaning is absolutely key to dealing with loss. It's hard work. So, you know, when you are actively striving to make meaning out of losses, it is hard work. And, you know, I think often we'd rather just put our feet up and watch silly TV, or at least some good sports. However, when you make meaning out of your loss, so people that maybe their loved one can no longer volunteer for a particular agency, say the food bank, but their loved one has always been passionate about the homeless and about those who are, food insecure. Maybe then we go down and volunteer and have respite care come in to look after our spouse so that we can continue on the legacy of the person we love. Even if the person is still alive, they might not be able to continue the legacy, but somehow we can. Making meaning is absolutely crucial. Another thing is tap into your faith or into your spirituality. And the reason why I say that is that generally speaking, part of making meaning is tapping into what was the reason for what happened. Was it that our family has a genetic predisposition to a particular illness? So now we are volunteering for the agency that represents those who have, let's say there's something called familial Alzheimer's disease, where people get Alzheimer's disease in their 40s. And there seems to be a genetic tendency. So maybe now in our 30s, we are volunteering at the Alzheimer's Society because we are making meaning out of the losses of our loved ones who may have died or may still be living with dementia, but we are making meaning because we're helping others, say spouses of people with dementia. If you tap into your spirituality or your faith, that's going to help you make meaning. And it's going to help you be able to lose the sense of, I have to control this. I have to have an answer. A prof I had in my master's degree, I was learning to do family counseling, and she was terrific. Dr. Lorraine Wright out of the U of C. She's a professor emeritus. But she worked with families with chronic illness, and they would say, we have to know the reason why our loved one has this illness, or why our loved one is going to die. And she would say, what if you never get an answer to why? What then? And that has always stuck with me, and I've used that. If we never get the why for why something happened, what then? And the what then is how do we move forward? And very often we move forward if we can make meaning out of our situation. Seek support from others that may have experienced similar circumstances. That's not always easy, but if you can, it's a good idea. If we don't know anyone, have we considered a support group? Now, I have to confess something. I have never gone to a support group, and there are support groups for those with stage 4 breast cancer. And I'm chicken. I'm very scared. And what am I so scared about? I'm scared about sitting in a group, making connections with people, and then finding one by one they're dying. So I am a real chicken when it comes to that. But the reason why I say a support group is that sometimes we can tell our story and people don't get it. And it's not that they're buffoons. It's not that they really don't care about us, but they're tongue-tied. They absolutely don't know what to say. Or in our society, there's the belief of, yep, you can grieve for about a week. If we're really nice, 2 or 3 weeks, but then get on with life. And for a lot of people, we can't really get on with life, or at least we cannot get on with life in the manner with which we want it to. Monitor your self-talk. If you are finding that you or your loved one think, you know what, I'm nothing. My life is worth nothing because I can no longer do that or this. Monitor your self-talk. We talk about cognitive behavioral therapy where we monitor our thoughts. And when we monitor our thoughts, we change our behavior. When we change our behavior, our emotions change and we start to get a circular pattern that is positive. What do we do with chronic sorrow? Pauline Boss was a researcher, I think still is, around 70s. She came up with the concept of ambiguous loss in the early 90s. And that concept, she was referring to veterans from the Vietnam War who never came back to the United States. But the family could never grieve because even though their son or daughter, but probably at that point in time it was a son, was physically absent, emotionally he was very present because the family could not see a deceased body. She flipped the concept around and said, okay, with dementia, it's very similar, but it's reverse. The person is physically present, and in many ways, they look kind of the same, but they're psychologically absent. And so she's talked about ambiguous loss, which often goes with chronic sorrow, that what we need to do is learn to live with paradox. And the paradox is, he is my husband, but he's not the same. Yes, he'll always be my husband, but he's not the same. He's not the man I married. This is my child, and I will forever love him or her, but this isn't what I had hoped for, or this isn't what I wanted to happen for this child. You know, in the case of, say, a car accident or a motorbike accident, this isn't what I had hoped now that my son is a paraplegic. And it's to be able to balance both of them. Is there an easy way to do that? No, but it leaves room for our emotions. It leaves room for the emotions that says, I love that person more than life itself, but also the sorrow and the grief that this isn't who I married or who I knew in the past. I'm just about done. I realize you folks have been very patient. Seek professional help when necessary for guilt or existential issues. If they are overriding you, if they are present a lot, seek help. Or for anger that doesn't lessen. It can be really helpful. The other thing is have regular visits with your family doc or nurse practitioner. Your blood pressure may be up. You may be feeling, you may not even know how stressed you are, but you can have significant changes that come from the stress of living with chronic loss and chronic sorrow, whether it be yourself or whether it be someone else. Now, I am finished, and I am certainly willing to answer some questions if people have any questions. I think Shauna's going to manage this portion with the mic.
Yeah, for sure. And that's all. Just see if anyone has a question here. Oh, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'll repeat your question. Yeah.
Okay. This was really helpful.
This is really helpful, Annette.
Yes. Working through my mom's short-term memory loss, I never knew it was grief, you know, and it's really helpful.
Okay, working through, what's your name?
Monica.
Monica, working through your mom's long-term memory loss.
Memory loss,
yeah, this has been, yeah, after a stroke, this has been very meaningful.
Sorry, Shauna. So I'm just going to repeat what I think you said. My hearing isn't the best. The individual said that what do we do with someone who's has significant memory loss that isn't improving following a stroke? Is that correct?
No, I'm not, that was just.
She's just
what
sharing
you
a
said,
comment.
it was
Okay.
really helpful.
Yeah, it was very
My
helpful.
question- Sorry, my question is, I see so many good things here, with a friend that's going through a long-term divorce. She hasn't seen her husband in 7 years, he left, never talked to her again. And I see so much of this helpful for something like that, I'm wondering if they see that in their studies.
Right, okay. What Monica is mentioning is she's got a friend that's been working through a long-term divorce. And there's a lot of themes that you mentioned that are just so relevant. And she was wondering if there's studies on that in the context of divorce. Is that right? Okay.
And is this related to stroke, the sense of worth?
Oh, sorry, divorce.
Oh, sorry, divorce?
Yes, yes, divorce.
Ah, yes. You know what? Divorce is tremendously difficult. And divorce really fits the category of chronic sorrow. You have multiple losses. And the losses involve loss of a spouse. Loss of, let's say, if the spouse was an accountant. Loss of someone that you went to dinner with, loss of being a couple, and loss of the Mrs. term, if you've used the Mrs. so-and-so. And divorce and research shows that divorce is tremendously difficult, in part because it's disenfranchised grief. And what we mean by disenfranchised grief is that it's not socially recognized. So if your spouse passes away, it's a horrible thing. I cannot imagine it. But one of the things that begins the healing, hopefully, is that you have a funeral. And if you have someone who says, please don't have a funeral, for me, just go out and have a beer and celebrate. Talk to them about the importance of a funeral, because the funeral is for the living. We need funerals, and Marlette has actually, she officiates funerals as well, and she has officiated funerals for someone 3 years after they died because the family could not move on. So, but we do not have a ritual for divorce. We do not have where there's a service and people say, Mary, I am so sorry for you. And how are you going to get through this? We don't know, but we're going to walk with you. We have none of that for divorce. And so divorce can be very difficult. And I've heard of people who have said, and seen it in the research, where people have said, it would have been easier had he died or had she died, because divorce involves some measure of rejection. And it also involves where you lose some status and this sort of thing. It's very difficult. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you, Annette.
Thank you. That was an excellent question.
Any other questions? Oh, yes, Denny.
Hi, Annette, it's Denny. My spouse died last June after 7 years with Alzheimer's. And I guess I have challenges around dealing with folks who don't seem to understand what you described as the grieving over those 7 years, and comments like, wow, it seemed like it was really quick. And that sort of thing. So there's the frustration, not wanting to come on as to try and educate them about what really went on.
Yeah.
during that time. And so it's a bit of a conundrum with not wanting to offend people, but still being frustrated and even at times kind of angry in terms of
Yeah.
how to respond to that. Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that is a really tough situation. And you're absolutely right. People don't want to talk about the 7 years where you experienced the downward progression of the dementia and all of that, and then the death, and people don't want to hear it. Marlette and I are working on a new book on grieving, and it's called Loving and Losing, but we're still writing it. But in it, I cite a study that was done for older adults whose adult child had passed away. And these older adults said they have to keep their mouth shut because if they ever bring up their adult child who passed away, people clam up or they walk away. And so they find themselves having to protect others. And so even though their heart is deeply burdened and they're very sad, they have to pretend like everything is fine in order to facilitate relationships with others. And I find that absolutely tragic. You know, I don't know if your wife passed away in a hospice, and if she did, if there's bereavement care. I don't know, but you have had cumulative losses all associated with your wife. And when there's cumulative losses, it exacts a very strong toll on the body. And so, I mean, the mind and the body and just overall in general. And I'm sorry about your loss. So June is still, that's relatively recent that your wife passed away. And it's really hard when you can't say anything because you have to protect others. But I would suggest, whether it's a support group through the Alzheimer's Society, whether it is bereavement care at a hospice or that sort of a thing, or a family doc that happens to be a good listener. Not all family docs are, but there's the odd one that really enjoys talking about larger than life issues. And that's what yours is a larger than life issue, even after your wife has passed. I would suggest that you access something like that if that may be helpful for you.
Thank you, Nat.
Thank you.
That's better than chewing someone's head off, right?
Yes. Although sometimes chewing someone's head off can be somewhat cathartic in the interim.
Kevin, and then Annette.
And I just wanted to thank you for so beautifully articulating everything that I'm feeling and that I'm experiencing. I feel and extend for transportation who's terminal. So I have a shared experience. My question is, how do the broadcasters, how do we connect with you as an investigator or a resource? I know hundreds, if not thousands, of people that need to hear this message because you deliver it so beautifully, so passionately, so honestly, and as said, subject that most people in Western society are incapable of having. So, first of all, a sincere thank you, and secondly, how to respect this message out. I know looking at the south, it's a really good
I'm gonna jump in, Annette, and Kevin, just correct me. I'm gonna give a quick replay. Kevin is walking through cancer himself and is relating to everything that Annette shared there. I'm very encouraged by her words. Kevin, you were saying that you know hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are walking this type of a journey, and you would love to know how there are resources or how Annette's message could be shared. Now, a little note, we are recording this talk. And actually this probably leads into Annette, just the topic of the books that you've written. But Annette, I'll let you respond to that.
And Shauna, I heard some of what you said. What was it? Was it Evan looking for, at the end, I heard that he has cancer and that, something about, was it a journey? Can you say that a little bit more? I apologize about my hearing.
Yes, he is walking through stage 4 cancer and is terminal. He's very much in the same shoes as you. He knows hundreds, if not thousands, of people that are walking through a journey very similar, and would love to get your message into their hands.
Oh, that Evan, thank you. That is so kind of you. And oh, that means a lot to me, and I'm so sorry for the situation you're going through, and for your situation that is terminal. My heart goes out to you. In terms of how does my message get out to other people, I honestly don't know. I have written one article on the problems with breast cancer discourse. However, that one is more academic. Marlette and I are writing a book about grief and loss that is not strongly academic. It is more conversational, but that hopefully will be ready sometime in July or August. But I'm not sure how that message can get out. Marlette, if you're there, do you have any suggestions? My twin sister is on Zoom still, I think.
She just has some technical difficulties, so she's not feeling too well after surgery.
Yeah.
She's laying down.
Okay. No problem at all. So Evan, thank you so much. That is such kind words, and I'm not quite sure how we can get this message out about what it's like to live with stage 4 cancer, and how people live well. I know some people, as far as breast cancer, they have stuff on the internet where they'll have a site and they'll talk about their experiences. So that may be one way that people can get information out. But it's hard sometimes because there's such a glut of information, both on the internet and in terms of books and that sort of thing. Sorry, that's a very poor response.
No, that's great, Annette. And we have been recording today's talk, so I will get that into people's hands. Annette, you've got a question. We've got a question from another Annette here.
Oh, very good.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Hi. Yeah, I think I can.
Okay, good. Marlette, if you're listening, hi Marlette, love you, praying for you. Anyway, Annette, I could come at this from a whole bunch of different directions. I really appreciated hearing you tonight, but the thing that's really pressing on my heart is I did hear you mention several times, in fact, multiple times, in the instances that you were talking about, persons feeling like they do need to protect others, and a big part of their own burden is not being able, to really express it or share it. In lots of ways, the Lord has just really led me to a whole new level of insight about grief companioning people after the actual deaths of their loved ones. You know, it's just a place that I've been brought into. How do you companion someone that is living with chronic sorrow? Do you have any advice about that? Would you give any direction to those of us that would want to, or that just find ourselves alongside people in those situations? How can we serve them? How can we best be their companions?
Thank you very much. I think I heard most of it but I didn't hear a question. Was there a question that I missed? And it's my hearing. I apologize.
Annette was wondering if you had suggestions as far as companioning with someone who is experiencing chronic sorrow. Practical suggestions for
For
being,
helping them?
yeah, being a good
Yeah.
grief companion.
Yeah, so if it is a person who has the chronic sorrow is for themselves because their life has changed and irreparably changed, and it cannot go back to what it was before. Part of that will be walking alongside of them, letting them know that they are still incredibly valuable, looking for their strengths, and that the strengths that they still have, and trying to capitalize on that and helping them see, can they go down a different path if they need to because of the strengths they have. Thank you. And so, and spending time with them is huge. If you have someone who is living with chronic sorrow, they may be sequestering themselves a little bit away from other people, either because they have to, because they can't get out of the house well enough, or they're caregiving for someone. But if you can spend time with them, that shows them that they're very valued. You know, if we don't spend time with people and we give them these quick little ditties, you know, there's always tomorrow, the sun will come out tomorrow. That isn't going to help. And it's a royal slap in the face. Spending time with people and being willing to talk with them about the difficulties and the losses they're experiencing, that's huge. Those would be my suggestions.
One quote I've heard is stay for the cup of coffee. I think in ministry situations, it's very common to walk in, have a quick chat, ask how they're doing, pray for them, and then zip out the door. But the meaningful part is actually staying and listening, and yeah, giving them that ability to share their story again and process. So stay for the coffee.
Yeah.
Any other last questions? I guess I have just one, Annette, and I'm just bouncing off of Denny here. Do you have any comments on the idea that walking with someone through a lengthy chronic illness, that somehow they've worked through the grief ahead of time? And
Yeah.
that it's lighter after they pass?
So, you know, that is such an interesting question or comment, Shauna, because we talk about that as being anticipatory grieving. And it used to be believed that if somebody grieves over a long period of time, they will actually grieve less when their loved one is gone because they've grieved that period of time. Now there's some question about anticipatory loss and grieving. Some people say, no, it makes absolutely no difference, that people can have walked a long period of time, like this gentleman, 7 years with his wife, but the grief is just as strong afterwards. I would say that it depends on the person, and it depends on the situation, whether the grief is a little less afterwards because of all that lengthy grieving, or whether the grief is just as profound as it would have been had it been a sudden death.
Thank you so much, Annette. We should probably wrap it up here, but I'd love to hear just briefly about the 3 books on the table.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
So the 3 books are, one of them is a textbook. It's older. It's 2015. We have a 2019 version of it, and it's older adults and transitions. But the 2019, we would have to charge $75, which is outrageous. So what we've got is some 2015s, and most of the information is the same. And those are $25. But we look at the transitions of older adults, like the health transitions, about existential transitions, about dying and death, and family involvement and how family helps. So that's that book. Then we have 2 other smaller books that are $15 each. One is Making Meaning in Older Age. It's how older adults can make meaning when they're not as physically able as they used to be, but they can still carve out a very useful existence. There was a study, and it's an old one, but by a researcher last name Cohen, and he surveyed people, and he found that people between 55 and 75 said these are the happiest years of their lives. Now, that's not always the case. Obviously, if you have a loved one with severe dementia, that's not the case. However, the notion of we can make meaning even when we're older, that our lives can have meaning. And then the other book, Marlette and I wrote it the first year when I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, and it's called The Meaning is in the Dirt and Meditations on Life's Richness. And it's broadly spiritual, and it has sort of daily readings on hopefully topics that are interesting. And so they're just bite-sized pieces in terms of reading. And both the Making Meaning and The Meaning is in the Dirt are both $15.
Well, thank you so much, Annette. We have been really blessed with all that you have shared today, and let's give a hand for here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You folks have been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much. It's been a privilege.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, Shauna.
Yes, bless you. We'll talk to you later, Annette.
Thank you. Bless you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.